There's a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to hotel rooms, not the loneliness of empty spaces or absent people, but the loneliness of a person who has just come from a room full of thousands and finds themselves, within the span of an hour, in a room that holds only the sound of an air conditioning unit and the faint noise of a city that does not know they are in it. Jim Morrison knew this loneliness better than almost anyone alive in 1968. He had spent the better part of 2 years moving between stages and hotel rooms, between the enormous collective experience of the concert and the absolute solitude of the hour after it, and the distance between those two states had become one of the defining facts of his daily life. It was in that distance, in the hotel rooms of Cincinnati and Chicago and Philadelphia and a dozen other cities, that he sat down, took out paper and wrote to Pamela Courson. Some of those letters were sent. Pamela received them in Lowe's Angels, in the small house on Rothdale Trail in Laurel Canyon that she and Jim shared when he was not on the road, and she kept them with the particular care of someone who understands that the written version of a person is not the same as the living version but is, in certain ways, more lasting. She kept the sent letters. She also kept the others, the ones that arrived in her hands not through the mail but through Jim's jacket pockets and the inside compartments of the bags he brought home from the road. The letters he had written and folded and carried with him and never posted. The letters that had been written for her and had never reached her. The letters that had reached her only after the tour was over and Jim was home, and the urgency that had produced them had passed into something quieter and harder to name. Pamela Courson never fully explained the unsent letters. She spoke about them in fragments, in the partial way that people speak about things they're still inside of, things that have not yet resolved into the kind of story that can be told from beginning to end. What she said, in the various conversations that the people closest to her remembered afterward, was that the unsent letters were different from the sent ones. Not in style, not in the quality of the writing, which was consistently extraordinary. Jim Morrison wrote prose the way he wrote poetry, with a density and precision that made even the most casual sentence carry weight. The difference was in what the unsent letters were willing to say. They went further. They pressed into territory that the sent letters circled around but did not enter. They said things that Jim Morrison, for reasons that Pamela understood without his ever having explained them, had decided the postal system should not carry. But to understand what those letters contained and what it meant that they were never sent, you have to understand what 1968 was for Jim Morrison and what the road had become. The Doors had released 3 albums by the end of 1967. Waiting for the Sun, their third, arrived in the summer of 1968 and reached #1 on the Billboard charts, the only Doors album that would ever do so. Jim Morrison was 24 years old, and by every external measure he was exactly where the music industry had promised that talent and ambition and the right combination of timing and circumstance could take a person. His face was on magazine covers. His voice was on radios in cities he had never visited. His words, the poems that had become the songs, were being sung back to him by crowds so large that the individuals within them dissolved into a single collective sound, a sound that had no relationship to any one person's experience of loneliness and was made of nothing else. The touring schedule in 1968 was relentless in the way that touring schedules were relentless for bands at the peak of their commercial moment, because the peak was understood to be temporary, and the industry's instinct was to extract from the peak everything it could yield before the moment passed. Jim Morrison did not control the schedule. The schedule controlled him, moving him from city to city with a mechanical efficiency that had no interest in what he was experiencing between the dates. He played the shows, he gave the interviews, he delivered, night after night, the performance that the image required, the Lizard King, the shaman, the dangerous edge of American rock and roll, and then he went back to the hotel room. And the hotel room was always the same room, regardless of which city it was in. The same beige walls, the same air conditioning unit, the same window looking out at a city that was indifferent to the fact of his presence in it. He had been with Pamela Courson since 1965. Their relationship was, by any ordinary measure, complicated, marked by the particular difficulties of two people who are drawn to each other with a force that neither of them entirely understands and that coexists uneasily and persistently with the other forces in their lives. Pamela was not the only woman in Jim's life during those years. Jim was not the only man in Pamela's. the relationship held this complexity without resolving it, because what held the relationship together was not simplicity but something more durable, a recognition between two people that the other person was, in some fundamental sense, the one who knew them. Not the image, not the persona, not the version of themselves they presented to the world, but the actual person underneath. Pamela knew Jim Morrison the way very few people ever managed to know him, directly, without the mediation of the mythology, in the particular way that you know someone when you have seen them be afraid and seen them be joyful and seen them in the ordinary hours between the performances. The tour kept him from her. This was the simple fact underneath all the other facts. And the letters were his response to that distance, an attempt to close it, or at least to acknowledge it, in the only way available to him when the road had taken him too far from Lowe's Angels to close it in person. He wrote in hotel rooms after the shows. This was the pattern that the people who traveled with him on the 1968 tour, road managers, equipment handlers, the occasional journalist permitted backstage, later described consistently. Jim would come off stage and move through the necessary machinery of the post-show. The conversations with promoters, the photographs, the brief managed interactions with the people who had found their way backstage. And then he would disengage quietly and without drama and go back to the room. And in the room he would write, not the notebooks were for something else, for the poems and the ideas and the pressing of language against the larger questions that occupied him continuously. The letters were different. The letters were addressed to a specific person, and the specificity of that address changed what the writing could do. It could be direct in a way the poems were not. It could say, I am in Cincinnati and the show was, and then whatever the show had been, described not as performance but as experience. It could say, I miss you in the particular way that I miss you, which is different from the general ache of missing someone and more specific than I have ever managed to say out loud. Some of what he wrote he folded into envelopes and gave to road managers to post. These were the sent letters, complete in themselves, sufficient as communication, saying what needed to be said. But there were other letters that he folded and did not give to anyone. He put them in the inside pocket of his jacket or in the zippered compartment of the bag he carried on the road, and he carried them with him from city to city, accumulating weight as the tour continued. Why he did not send them was something he never directly explained to Pamela. She found them when he came home, reached into the jacket he had worn throughout the tour, or opened the bag compartment that she had not opened before and found the folded pages. She recognized his handwriting immediately. She recognized her name at the top of each page. And she read letters that had traveled thousands of miles without moving, that had been in cities she had not been in, that had been carried through the noise and the light and the collective roar of sold-out arenas, and had never left the dark of an inside pocket. What she read in those letters, Pamela would say to the small number of people she trusted with this information, was Jim without the distance that the road created. The sent letters were Jim writing from the road, aware of the distance, managing it, maintaining across it the connection that mattered to him. The unsent letters were Jim writing as if the distance did not exist, as if Pamela were in the room, as if the words were being spoken rather than written. They said things that the sent letters had prepared to say and then pulled back from. They said things about fear, not the ordinary fear of failure or exposure, but the deeper fear of the person who has found themselves living at a velocity they did not entirely choose and cannot entirely slow, and who wonders in the hotel room at 2 in the morning whether the person they were before all of this is still accessible or has been replaced by the person all of this requires. They said things about Pamela herself, what she represented to him, which was not a simple thing and could not be made simple. Without losing what it actually was, she was the person who knew him before, who had known the UCLA film student, the Venice Beach pier poet, the man who had said, I don't play anything to Ray Manzarek, and meant, I have not yet found the container for what I need to say. She had watched him find the container and watched what happened when the container became larger than the thing it was meant to hold. She had watched the Lizard King persona accumulate around him like weather, and she had never, this was the thing the unsent letters kept returning to, she had never confused the weather with the person inside it. In a life that had become organized around the confusion of that distinction, Pamela's clarity was the most valuable thing Jim Morrison possessed. and he could not say this in a sent letter because saying it required a vulnerability that the postal system felt somehow too public a vehicle to carry. The unsent letters stayed with Pamela after Jim died in Paris in July 1971. She died 8 months later in March 1972 of a heroin overdose in the same apartment on Rue Beautreillis where Jim had died. She was 27 years old, the same age he had been. The letters passed into the keeping of the Morrison estate, and their precise contents have never been fully published or disclosed. What is known comes from the fragments Pamela shared in conversation before her death, from the accounts of those she trusted, and from the particular silence that surrounds the unsent letters in every serious account of Jim Morrison's life, a silence that is not the silence of absence, but the silence of something present that has not yet been fully heard. Jim Morrison spent 2 years moving between stages and hotel rooms, between the roar of the crowd and the quiet of the room after, and in the quiet he wrote letters to the one person whose knowing of him was not mediated by the image. Some of those letters he sent, some of them he carried. The ones he carried were the truest ones, the ones that said what he actually meant without the management that the distance seemed to require. They were addressed to Pamela, and they never reached her through the mail, but they reached her. They reached her in the inside pocket of a jacket he brought home from the road, heavy with the weight of all the cities they had traveled through and all the things he had not found the right moment to say. She kept them, of course she kept them. They were the most direct thing he had ever given her, the words he had written in the hotel rooms of 1968, alone after the shows, in the particular loneliness that belongs to people who have just come from a room full of thousands and find themselves, within the span of an hour, in a room that holds only their own voice and the faint noise of a city that does not know they are in it. The city never knew, but Pamela did, and that, in the end, was the only thing that had ever mattered to him. What the road managers who traveled with the Doors in 1968 remembered most consistently was not the performances, though the performances were extraordinary, the kind of thing you did not forget if you had been present for them. What they remembered was the stillness that followed the performances. The way Jim Morrison could move from the absolute maximum of human presence, 2 hours of stage time during which he generated more concentrated attention than most people experience in a lifetime, to a quality of solitude so complete that the people around him sometimes felt they had imagined the previous 2 hours. The transition was not gradual. It was immediate, the way a light goes out rather than dims. The show would end and Jim would walk off stage, and within 10 minutes he would be someone else entirely. Quieter, smaller, more interior, the person who had been inside the performance retreating into himself with the completeness of someone who has said everything they had to say for one evening and has nothing left for the world until tomorrow. Bill Siddons, the band's manager, traveled with them through significant portions of the 1968 schedule. He was 20 years old at the time, newly in the role, still learning what managing Jim Morrison required and what it could not provide. He observed the post-show ritual without fully understanding it. Jim would disengage from the backstage activity and go to the hotel. The next morning he would appear for the drive to the airport or the next venue, looking like someone who had slept adequately and was ready to continue. What happened in the intervening hours, the hotel room, the air conditioning unit, the writing, was not something Jim discussed directly. But Bill Siddons noticed, on the occasions when he was in adjacent rooms or shared transport with Jim the following morning, that Jim sometimes carried something in his jacket pocket that he did not carry before the show. A folded thickness of paper, pages that had not been there before and that Jim did not reference and that Siddons, with the discretion of someone learning his job, did not ask about. The sent letters and the unsent letters existed in parallel throughout the 1968 tour, and Pamela Courson lived with both, received the sent ones through the mail in Laurel Canyon, found the unsent ones in the jacket when Jim came home. She had a particular relationship with the written Jim, the version of him that existed in language directed specifically at her, that was different from her relationship with the performed Jim, or even the private Jim who sat across from her in the house on Rothdale Trail. The written Jim was the most unguarded of the versions, freed from the requirements of presence, freed from the image, freed even from the ordinary social management that face-to-face conversation requires. In the letters, Jim Morrison could say things that his physical presence made harder to say because physical presence carries its own demands. The maintenance of composure, the management of expression, the thousand small adjustments that people make in the presence of another person without knowing they are making them. In the letters, he did not make those adjustments. He wrote the way he wrote in the notebooks, directly, pressing toward the thing he meant rather than the thing that could be safely said. And Pamela, reading the letters in Laurel Canyon and then reading the unsent ones when he came home, received a version of Jim Morrison that very few people ever received, the one that had stopped performing even the performance of intimacy and was simply there on the page, saying what he actually meant. She described one of the unsent letters in a conversation with a close friend as the most frightening thing she had ever read that was not frightening because it was dark. She said it was frightening because it was completely clear. She said Jim had written about what he thought was happening to him, not to the career, not to the band, not to the image, but to the interior person, the one who wrote the poems and had stood on the Venice beach pier with a notebook before any of this existed. He had written about whether that person was surviving the velocity of the career that had grown up around him. Not in a self-pitying way, Jim Morrison was constitutionally resistant to self-pity, which was one of the things that made him both remarkable and difficult. But in the clear-eyed way of someone who is conducting an honest assessment and reporting the results without softening them. He was not sure he had written. He was not sure the interior person was keeping up with the exterior story, and he was writing to her because she was the only one who would understand what the distinction meant.